I'm ready.
All right. My name is Harold Karabell. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm nearly 70 years old, and I've lived well over half my life in St. Louis. Most recently, 36 years continuously. I'm sort of a refugee from academia. I formerly was a history professor at a number of institutions in Indianapolis, Indiana, most notably Indiana University's Indianapolis campus. It's a branch campus of the Bloomington School. And for the last 36 years, I've been the general manager of a small family property management company, doing business exclusively in historic neighborhoods and managing large historic properties within the municipal boundaries of the city of St. Louis. So we have a number of tenants, and as you might expect, quite a few have been affected in one way or the other by the novel coronavirus.
And has anyone been hospitalized?
As far as I know, about half a dozen people have been hospitalized for varying lengths of time, and that's one way in which they've been affected, the most directly, of course, being physical. There are other ways they've been affected also, and that our business has been affected as well.
And has anybody died? Or?
No, no one whom I know personally has died, thank goodness. No one. I know of people, chiefly elderly relatives of friends or friends of friends and acquaintances who I know have died from it, but in our immediate circle, business and family-wise, thank goodness, no.
And in your family circle, has anyone had it? Yourself or your kids?
Well, because this virus, in my opinion, is still considerably a moving target, I can't answer that question definitively. For example, I had flu-like symptoms months ago that might have been the novel coronavirus. But within my immediate family, and I have 3 sons, none of us, thank goodness, has developed the virus, tested positive for the virus, or exhibited serious symptoms. I do have a first cousin once removed, however, who suffered the most defining characteristics of the disease, I think, were the most extraordinary characteristics of the disease. And thankfully, it wasn't terminal in his case. A young man, he's in his early to mid-30s. He lost his sense of taste and his sense of smell. And whether they've been regained, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And so it has affected your business. How is that?
Yeah, it has. It's affected it in 2 ways. One, we rent to a number of people who work in the restaurant industry, for example, or the hospitality industry. And a number of these people don't really have much in the way of financial resources to fall back upon. So when the tourist industry, the restaurant industry, hospitality industry as it's often called, went into not really a recession, but what I would consider to be an actual depression a few months into the pandemic, they lost their jobs, and we've had to scramble to find ways to get them rental assistance, for them to find rental assistance, and to work out all sorts of payment plans. We're very, very understanding with people as much as we can be, given the fact that we have enormous bills to pay as well, just to keep the business and the buildings operating. So that's one way that they've been harmed by the pandemic, and we've been affected directly. Is financially. The other aspect of our business, we have a very small percentage of our business devoted to what I would call short-term rentals, sort of Airbnb type rentals, and it's a very, very small percentage of the overall number of apartments that we manage, but it constitutes a fairly good percentage of our gross income, and that tanked. That truly went into a depression once the pandemic was full blown in this country. It's somewhat recovered. That part of our market is somewhat recovered, but for a while we were in desperate financial straits as a result.
Really? And so has this caused a lot of anxiety?
You know, is that for me personally? I will tell you a story. I'm one of the very few people whom you will ever interview who actually knew someone extraordinarily well who lived through the influenza pandemic of the Great War, and that was my mother. My mother died 20 years ago. She was an older person, an older mother, 44 when I was born, and she was 10 years old at the time of the influenza pandemic. So her memories of it were fairly clear, and she recalls living in essentially a working class immigrant Jewish neighborhood in Indianapolis, Indiana, Eastern European immigrant neighborhood. She recalls seeing body after body being taken out of neighboring houses and apartment buildings. So I've lived my entire life with that knowledge, and with the awareness, and with my knowledge of history to my academic knowledge, that a pandemic is not necessarily a thing of the past. What I have feared, lived with this kind of anxiety for decades, is a truly horrific pandemic in terms of mortality. I expected within my lifetime to see a pandemic, but I expected it to be one of the horrific hemorrhaging viruses, like Ebola, for example, which can't be discounted, of course, or a hantavirus from the four corners of the Southwest. So I've lived with that knowledge, and this is one more. So that a pandemic occurred did not surprise me. That the lack of preparedness by the federal government and even by the medical industry itself was shocking, however.
And I mean, so your family get-togethers have been curtailed at all, or no?
Well,
or?
pretty much so. We've really restricted our in-person family interactions to the immediate family. My oldest son lives in St. Louis with his fiancée, and so we've had them over. We've done social distancing with other less closely related family members and with some friends, typically outdoors. So that much, yes, it's affected our social life, but not always in negative ways. As other people have pointed out, there are some, almost perversely I say this, some beneficial or even salutary, if you'll let me use that word, byproduct of this pandemic, which is that people discover simple pleasures, like eating at home more. We've truly curtailed eating out, which is one of the great joys of living in urban America, patronizing one's favorite restaurants. And I feel obligated to do that just to help them financially. But it's great to rediscover even more the joys of eating at home. And my wife, Karen, for example, who is a great vegetarian cook before the pandemic, has become a gourmet vegetarian cook as a result. And I hope all of us have learned to take absolutely nothing for granted. We had this longest sustained period of below zero weather in St. Louis in decades, just before you arrived a couple of weeks ago. And from that, I've learned one should learn to take nothing for granted, that the electric stayed on here where it didn't in Texas, that we had hot water, for example, and heat. So one should learn to appreciate the blessings of life even more because of the pandemic and things like the polar vortex, I think.
And your happiness level, is it like 10 being the highest and 1 being the lowest? Has it really been affected from last year to this?
In my case, probably less than other people, because I know the vicissitudes of life. In my business, I deal with so many human beings. I think I've seen every sort of person put on this earth on 2 legs by the Creator. So I know the wide range of human behavior on an individual level. I know people's ups and downs financially. I know their life stories intimately. I think of my mother's life experience at the age of 10, living through the influenza pandemic and World War I. She lived through the Great Depression. She lived through World War II. I don't expect life to be easy, and I don't expect it to be problematic. And I know that in the long run, just in medical terms, talking about this pandemic, that bacteria and viruses are never defeated. We can only control them, hopefully. We can only manage them. In the long run, they are the victors, I think. So I never have had a very high happiness level. What life has done, and what the pandemic has done, and the polar vortex has done, is made me appreciate the blessings that we have in life, and probably lowered my bar very much. My expectations as a young person for life were much higher, and it's not simply the pandemic that's lowered them or the polar vortex. It's just understanding life and the limitations that all of us have as a human being, no matter what class, what race, what age, what social system we live under. There are simply limitations, existential limits, to human life.
Any final thoughts about COVID in this year and your response and how you're living with it? Our project is about people who live with this and how they're adjusting.
Well, I think to adjust, I've accepted masks as a fact of life. And I think people who don't accept them as a fact of life are not only fooling themselves, but they're endangering others. They're at risk of becoming spreaders and occasionally super spreaders even. Social distancing, I think, is a reality of life for at least the near term, until we acquire something approaching herd immunity, until the overwhelming majority of us, are vaccinated. So we learn to adjust. We learn to live with this. The good old days never were the good old days. I can remember when my oldest son was young, 8, 9, 10 maybe, and my mother was in her late 80s and, complaining about how bad things are, how the news is. And this is well before we had the pandemic, of course, decades before, and many decades after she had lived through the influenza pandemic. Oh, and she had diphtheria as a child also. One of the very few people, when she was in the hospital terminally ill, one of the few people any of the doctors, maybe the only person any of the medical staff, physicians and nurses had seen who ever had diphtheria. So she lived through all of that. So she was complaining to my oldest son, it's just terrible, terrible, terrible. If there were a monastic tradition in Judaism, I would join. In other words, she'd enter a convent if there were such a thing within the Jewish tradition. And he said to her, and he was only 10 years old. He said, "Grandma, remember when you were a younger woman? The Holocaust was a great old time, wasn't it?" So as human beings, we live with difficulties. This is one challenge out of many, one unexpected by many people, one that I feared for decades I would see in my lifetime. And I did, though I misidentified the source of it. I foolishly overlooked the evidence with SARS and with MERS, for example. And I concentrated more on the possibilities of the hemorrhaging viruses because of their horrific symptoms and the horrific levels of mortality, while ignoring the more recent evidence that we would quite likely have a respiratory pandemic based on the precedents set by SARS and MERS.
Well, thank you very much. This is March the 8th, and we are in St. Louis. And I have to thank you again for putting me up here at your fine home and seeing me on the road and picking up a stranger and giving him an abode for the evening, a castle, basically. Thank you very much.
Well, of course, it was completely serendipitous, or if you're a person of faith, you can call it providential, just to meet you going opposite directions on my bicycle, being intrigued by your load and your sign on the back, and turning around and talking to you. And I'm glad it all worked out so beautifully. So call it serendipitous, fortuitous, providential. I'm glad it worked out well for everyone.
Thank you again.